Jacob stood at the bus stop, patiently waiting for the clients. He held a special case with his simple equipment, consisting of a couple of shovels of different types. Following every passing car with his eyes, Jacob impatiently tapped his foot. He wanted to finish this job as quickly as possible, get paid, and go back home. His wife Amanda had long dreamed of a trip to Miami, but something always got in the way for Jacob. Sometimes it was the lack of money, other times he had too much work. "It's okay, I'll just save up a bit, then we'll definitely take that trip," Jacob reassured himself. There was still no sign of the client, and the man was getting anxious. Finally, a car pulled up a couple of yards away from Jacob. The owner stepped out and opened the trunk. Jacob quickly placed his tools inside the trunk and took the passenger seat. Jacob had been working as a gravedigger for several years and never complained about lack of work. His profession wasn't affected by financial markets or changes in the government. His task was simply to prepare everything so that the departed could be laid to rest with all the proper procedures and honors. Digging graves wasn't easy, but he was used to it and considered himself a professional in this line of work. The driver of the Ford didn't utter a single word during their drive. Jacob looked out the window, watching people go about their business in a monotonous rhythm. Soon they arrived at the massive gates of the city cemetery, a place familiar to Jacob from previous jobs. The client took Jacob to the right spot and wished him luck, saying that he would come back for him as soon as he finished. Before starting to dig, Jacob took a look around. It wasn't the best spot, as there was an old grave nearby. Jacob didn't like such jobs. Given the proximity of another grave, Jacob had to be very careful, which made the digging process more challenging. Jacob did a preliminary markup and got down to business. On the opposite side was another grave, which required Jacob to work with meticulous precision. The soil was yielding easily, and Jacob even caught himself thinking that he would finish earlier than he planned. But when he dug out about half of the required depth, the ground changed composition and was now filled with small, rocky crumbs. Well, there you go. I jumped to conclusions too quickly, Jacob thought. He should have known better, as that wasn't the first time something like that happened to him. Despite his age, the gravedigger was quite experienced and dug into the ground like a mole. Soon Jacob's efforts paid off, and the stony soil yielded to his pressure. That's much better. I'm really good at my job after all, Jacob said sarcastically to no one in particular. Suddenly, as he attempted to deepen the bottom of the grave, something crunched beneath his foot. Startled, Jacob flinched as his leg sank up to his ankle into something unknown. A coffin. It must be a coffin. A thought flashed through Jacob's mind. Only then did he realize that when the tombstone on the neighboring grave was installed, it was mistakenly placed a couple of feet to the left. As a result, the coffin ended up outside of the burial plot, leading to such an unfortunate consequence. Jacob wasn't superstitious, but even he couldn't just ignore what had happened. I hope my leg is fine. Why did I have to dig so deep? The young gravedigger was scolding himself. Trying to move around as little as possible, Jacob took the shovel and attempted to widen the opening in which his foot was stuck. To his surprise, the coffin was solid and remarkably well preserved, which was unexpected given its age. Jacob was covered in sweat, but he managed to finally free his foot from the coffin. He didn't really want to peek inside and see what was at the bottom. And what could he have found there? But suddenly, Jacob noticed something strange at his feet. It looked somewhat like a baseball card or a small calendar. It must have fallen out of the coffin when he pulled his foot out. Jacob was crazy about baseball and had been collecting cards with famous athletes since childhood. He inherited this hobby from his father, who had amassed a decent collection of autographed cards from world-renowned stars. Leaning over the coffin, Jacob picked up the mysterious item and recoiled in surprise. It wasn't a baseball card, but a photograph. An old, yellowed photograph with curled edges. It pictured a pleasant-looking young man in a business suit and a hat. But as Jacob looked more closely, he realized that the man was standing in the exact same spot that he was right at that moment. The gravedigger recognized the place by the well-preserved tombstone dating back to the beginning of the last century. Whoa, wow, that's interesting. I never would have thought I'd find something like this," Jacob whispered. Having made the decision to keep the photograph, he put it in his pocket and carefully covered everything with soil. Now the coffin at the bottom wouldn't be visible, so he wouldn't interfere with the burial. Jacob understood that his job was done, which meant that he could call his client for him to come and pick Jacob up. The only thing that troubled Jacob was that photograph. He had no doubt about its age and authenticity, but the location of the photo shoot raised some questions. Could someone have decided to get photographed at their own gravesite? It's all so strange, although stranger things have happened. Some people want to be buried with jewelry, cell phones, and even household items. So why am I even surprised anymore? Jacob tried to calm his nerves. Having climbed out of the grave, Jacob dusted himself off and sat on the nearest bench. He decided not to call the client just yet, thinking that he must be busy organizing the funeral scheduled later that day. It's okay, I can wait. The man is going through a horrible time. He deserves some understanding, Jacob thought. Soon, the relatives of the deceased started gathering by the burial site. Most of them were elderly, leading Jacob to conclude that he was digging the grave for the wife or sister of the deceased man, whose photo now rested in the pocket of his work jacket. Meanwhile, more and more people came to the cemetery. From bits and pieces of the conversation Jacob overheard, he learned that they were burying Barbara Parker, who was 85 years old at the time of her passing. Jacob looked at the gravestone on the neighboring grave and realized that Roger Parker, her husband, was buried there. Watching the funeral from a distance, Jacob absent-mindedly examined the faces of the mourners passing by. Suddenly, the gravedigger saw something that made him shudder. There was a young man standing next to Mrs. Parker's coffin, and he looked like the exact copy of the man depicted in that very photograph. No, that's impossible. I'm probably suffering from a heat stroke or something, the young gravedigger tried to convince himself. But no matter how much Jacob rubbed his eyes and stared at the stranger's face, nothing changed. He looked exactly like the late Roger Parker. The young man was most likely Barbara Parker's grandson, who came to bid his grandmother a final farewell. Just as Jacob was about to get up from the bench and head for the exit, he noticed another strange thing. This time, however, it had nothing to do with the young man resembling the one in the photo. It was about a man who had infiltrated the crowd of the grieving relatives. He looked very disturbing. His eyes showed neither sadness nor grief. The stranger's face contorted into a wicked grin, indicating that he didn't care about what was happening at that moment. Moreover, he kept his hand in his pocket as if he were hiding something. Jacob felt that something was off. Then he saw the strange man take an elongated object with a couple of buttons and a dimly flashing light out of his pocket. The man tensed up visibly and started slowly going backwards, intending to distance himself from the funeral as much as possible. Having realized that the stranger was up to no good, Jacob rushed towards him. He pushed the suspicious visitor from behind, which knocked the mysterious device right out of his hands. Then Jacob pinned the man to the ground with his own body. The crowd started buzzing, and someone called the police. As it turned out later, Jacob's actions were entirely justified. Apparently, what the stranger was holding was a remote control for an explosive device. It had been planted under the neighboring gravestone, and if detonated, it would have caused great grief and harm to many innocent people. Facing the news cameras later that day, Jacob recounted how he accidentally noticed that the man was holding a remote control of a bomb. He chose not to mention the photograph he found in the coffin, as he didn't want to upset the relatives of the deceased. After the interview, the man who looked exactly like the person in the photo approached Jacob and shook his hand. "I'm Michael Parker. These are my late grandparents." He nodded towards the graves. Jacob nodded and looked intently into the man's eyes. In the meantime, Michael continued. "The assassination attempt was targeted at me. I work for an organization that awards contracts for urban construction. A month ago, I denied this man's permission to build a mall in the city's park zone. He must have held a grudge and decided to get back at me. Thanks to you, I'm in the clear now. Otherwise..." Jacob smiled, pulled the photograph out of his pocket, and handed it to the young businessman. Now everything made sense. Michael was the grandson of the late Roger Parker, which was why he looked so much like him. After a brief silence, Jacob was about to head home when Michael stopped him and handed him a thick envelope. "This is a reward for your work and help. Please take it. I always pay off my debts, and I am truly grateful for everything you did today," Michael explained, intercepting Jacob's surprised look. Jacob smiled and thanked the man. Inside the envelope was enough money for Michael to buy 2 tickets to Miami, to go on the vacation with his wife that they'd long been dreaming of. On his way home, Jacob bought a bouquet of roses for his wife, intending to share the pleasant news with her. Meanwhile, Michael looked at the photograph of his late grandfather, wiped away a tear that ran down his face, and got into his car. He had a lot of work to do. Barbara and Roger Parker could rest assured that their grandson's life would always be filled with abundance and financial stability, because that had always been his top priority in life.